Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the absolute coolest redemption arcs in gaming history. If you've ever waded through the tall grass in the early Pokemon games, you know exactly who we're talking about today. Yep, we're looking at the evolution of Beedrill. We're going to see how a super fragile early game bug, a creature most of us caught, evolved and literally immediately tossed into a PC box, somehow transformed into an absolute competitive terror. But to really get Beedrill, we can't just look at its in-game stats. We actually have to look at the very fabric of Japanese society that brought it to life in the first place.
So the big question we're tackling today is this. How exactly did a Pokemon that was fundamentally designed to be weak eventually rise up to completely dominate high-level competitive play? It is a wild story, full of intentional game design, massive mechanical overhauls, and, honestly, the enduring appeal of the true underdog.
Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The birth of Beedrill. 2. A fragile foundation. 3. The Mega Evolution redemption. 4. Dominating competitive play. And 5. Beedrill's cultural legacy. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The birth of Beedrill. Curing social isolation. To understand why early bug Pokemon like Weedle and Beedrill exist the way they do, we've got to travel back to 1990s Japan. The creator of the franchise, Satoshi Tajiri, noticed this really troubling trend. Young people in Japan were facing massive pressure from school, dealing with widespread bullying, and they were just isolating themselves. They'd be commuting on the train, heads down, totally glued to their Game Boys. Tajiri realized that these increasingly complex video games were kind of pulling players into solitary, isolated virtual worlds. He saw kids retreating into screens instead of actually forming bonds with each other, and he wanted to fix that. He wanted to take the pure childhood joy he felt collecting real-world bugs like bees and beetles and turn it into a literal digital cure for modern loneliness. And this quote brilliantly sums up his whole solution. Tajiri famously said that the goal was to use communication with Pokemon to create a community of friends. See, by giving kids common, super accessible bugs like Weedle right at the start of the game, they immediately had a digital commodity. But here's the absolute genius part. Tajiri and Shigeru Miyamoto designed the game so you physically could not collect everything on your own. You needed the Game Link cable. A kid could catch a Beedrill, find a buddy with a different version of the game, and literally connect their devices to trade. Catching this simple little bug was deliberately built into the game to force kids to look up from their screens, communicate, and form a real human connection. Section 2. A fragile foundation, the struggle of base Beedrill. Now, while this bug was awesome for making real-world friends, it wasn't exactly great for winning battles. The game's design inherently makes Beedrill a low-tier creature, and that's specifically because of how incredibly easy it is to get. You catch a Weedle almost right out of the gate. By just level 7, it evolves into Kakuna, and at a mere level 10, boom, it reaches its final form, Beedrill. This 3-stage evolution chain is unbelievably fast. It's basically designed to give brand new players a really quick taste of the whole evolution mechanic and a fun little temporary power spike in those early hours. But as you might guess, that early accessibility comes at a massive, permanent cost down the road. What's really fascinating is how that cost translates into the actual numbers. Base Beedrill has a base stat total of only 395. That lands it firmly in the C tier of Pokemon strength. Now, an attack stat of 90, that's actually pretty decent for the early game, and 75 speed is workable, but its physical defense is an abysmal 40. It is incredibly, incredibly fragile. So as the game progresses and your opponents naturally get stronger, Beedrill simply cannot survive a hit. It's made of glass. To make matters even worse, its bug and poison typing is just a defensive nightmare. It carries 4 major weaknesses to some very common offensive types: fire, flying, psychic, and rock. If a Charizard even looks at it with Flamethrower or an Espeon uses Psyshock, Beedrill is instantly knocked out. For generations, players absolutely loved its design, but mechanically, the Poison Bee Pokémon was hopelessly outclassed. It really felt like an underdog that was destined to just stay at the bottom of the barrel forever. Section 3. The Mega Evolution Redemption, Beedrill's hero moment. But then, everything flipped. In Generation 7, the developers threw our favorite underdog an absolutely massive lifeline with a totally new ability called adaptability. The first piece of this redemption puzzle is how this ability actually works. Normally, when a Pokémon uses an attack matching its type, like a bug type using a bug move, it gets a 1.5 times damage multiplier. That's the same type attack bonus. Adaptability takes that and cranks it all the way up to a flat 2 times multiplier. This means Mega Beedrill's bug and poison attacks were suddenly hitting with terrifying, unadulterated force. But hey, And ability alone isn't enough, right? It needed the stats to back it up. Now, when Mega Evolving, a Pokémon is granted 100 extra base stats. But the developers did something brilliantly ruthless here. They didn't just casually sprinkle stats around. They min-maxed Beedrill to the extreme. They actually lowered its entirely useless special attack stat from 45 down to a genuinely comical 15. By stripping away the stats it literally didn't need, they were able to pump its physical attack from 90 to a monster's 150, and its speed to a blinding 145. They completely embraced its physical fragility and transformed it into a hyper-fast, heavy-hitting assassin.
Section 4. Dominating competitive play. Smogon and Pokémon Go. So what exactly happens when you give an underdog stats like that? Well, this radical stat redistribution completely transformed Beedrill from a beginner's crutch into a genuine top-tier threat. In the competitive Smogon underused, or UU tier, Mega Beedrill became totally feared as an offensive pivot. Because, remember, its defense is still essentially non-existent. It cannot take a punch. So the whole strategy is to just never get hit in the first place. Players use that blazing 145 speed to strike first with U-turn, which deals massive damage and instantly switches it out for a teammate, gaining all that vital momentum. Then it uses Poison Jab to apply super heavy pressure to Fairy and Grass types. It brings Drill Run to catch Steel and Fire types completely off guard, and Knock Off to rip vital items away from bulky opponents. It literally darts in, deals devastating damage, and darts right back out before the opponent can even react.
And the crazy part? This dominance isn't just limited to the mainline games. Look at the data for Pokémon Go. Mega Beedrill stands tall as one of the absolute premier bug attackers in the entire game. For player versus player formats, the optimal build pairs the super fast energy generation of Poison Jab with the incredibly cheap, fast charged move, X-Skizzer. It's just perfect for burning through your opponent's shields. And in raids, you swap that for Sludge Bomb to maximize its poison-type damage output. So across entirely different battle systems, Mega Beedrill absolutely proved its worth as a major offensive powerhouse. Section 5. Beedrill's Cultural Legacy. From Fragile Bug to Icon. Alright, so we've seen the stats and we've seen the competitive strategies, but how does this super intense competitive bug fit into the broader cultural phenomenon of the franchise? Well, what makes Beedrill so fascinating is the wild juxtaposition of its identity. I mean, the Pokédex describes it flying at violent speeds, aggressively stabbing enemies with the toxic stingers on its rear. It is objectively menacing. Yet it exists perfectly within the Japanese cultural aesthetic known as kawaii, or cuteness, a culture that really prizes approachability and comfort. Beedrill straddles this line so perfectly. It's a fierce monster that paradoxically acts as a bridge. By capturing, battling, and eventually mega-evolving this creature, players form a real attachment to it. The game creates this infinite network of relationships, successfully breaking down the lines between a violent virtual bug and the real children and adults who are actually playing the game. And that brings us perfectly full circle back to Satoshi Tajiri's original vision. The sociologist Anne Allison pointed out that Tajiri loved the idea of a child trading one of their Pokémon for a bowl of ramen or a comic book, because Beedrill isn't just a collection of pixels or an attack stat of 150. Whether it was being physically traded across a link cable back in 1996 or acting as an offensive pivot in a modern online tournament today, it literally serves as a currency of friendship. It fulfilled that ultimate goal of blending economies and pleasures, and most importantly, drawing isolated people together through a shared experience. The evolution of Beedrill is this perfect reminder that in well-designed systems, absolutely nothing is truly useless. Sometimes an underdog just needs the right environment, or, the right megastone, to show its true potential. Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought to take away from this explainer today. With over 1,000 creatures now in the franchise, what other totally forgotten underdog Pokémon might be sitting in a PC box right now, just waiting for their own chance to completely shake up the competitive world? Thank you so much for joining me, and keep exploring.